name is Rick Herder, and as Ben said, I teach here at SMSU. And I love storytelling. I mean, that wasn't quite how I was going to begin things, but I should tell you this, that I love storytelling. I grew up in my parents owned a bar, a nightclub, and I grew up around a lot of storytellers. And so if we wanted lunch money, we'd have to go and see Dad, and getting a signal to move this closer. We wanted lunch money, we'd have to go see Dad and say, you know, Dad, I need, you know, $2 for lunch this week, or whatever it was, you know, back in those days. And he would, and as part of getting that money, we would get some free pop and some free candy probably, and hear stories, you know, from the patrons, because a bar is a storytelling place. And I ended up doing my dissertation work on storytelling. And so, not exactly this kind of storytelling, but still, I love it. When I defended my dissertation, that's what I did, is I talked about my dad at the bar and how important that is to us. You know, we are homo narrators, we are storytellers. It's what we do, it's how we make the world, right? So, tonight I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me back, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, and I'm going to leave a few of the details a little bit fuzzy here, partly because I want to protect the identity of the person who's the center of this story. But 15, 20 years ago, I was teaching down in Naples, Florida, and I've taught several places. I taught up in the central part of the state in Staples. We moved from there down to Naples, down in southwest Florida, and I taught in a couple of schools down there, and I taught in 3 different university settings. But for a few years down in South Florida, I taught in an adult education program, and for 3 or 4 years of that time, I taught in a county jail, part-time in the evenings, you know, after teaching during the day. And I would walk in on Tuesday nights into this into the county jail, and you'd have to hand over your ID, and they look you in the eye and, you know, match it up and everything. You'd have to go through security and walk back, go by the deputy station there, and go into this little room, and they would send some people in who wanted to study. They wanted to work. Some of these people were there for the GED lessons, or they were there to learn English, and a few of them were there for adult basic education lessons. These are folks whose reading scores and their math scores were probably low based on the tests that we had. Well, and one of the students that I had in that ABE program, I'm going to call him, like I said, I'm obscuring the name, I'm going to call him George Wallace. Now, the reason I'm calling him, and some of you may recognize that name, George Wallace, you know, the George Wallace, you know, former governor, thankfully, of Alabama and such. He's the man who's known for standing in the steps of the University of Alabama and saying, segregation now! You know, segregation yesterday, segregation now, segregation forever. That George Wallace. Well, I'm going to call him that for a reason, because my student had a different name of a different racist politician who stood for exactly the same things, and he happened to be a black middle-aged man. And so that's part of the story that will figure in here in just a minute. But I wanted to, you know, I could give a fig about the politician's identity, but I want to protect George and not give his full identity. So the rest of this, I promise you, every word is true. And because I'm a teacher, I should tell you as well that this, like a lot of stories, this story comes with a lesson at the end. So when I walked in on Tuesday nights, I was there to teach, and we would exchange stories about students. And George Nara, what was his first? Gene Nara, that's it. Gene Nara, the other teacher, told me some stories about George Wallace, my student, and the deputies told me stories about George, because George was sort of the byword for the crack addict in the jail. George had become the signifier for the repeat criminal. And the story was that George was addicted to crack cocaine. He still lived, he was 30-some years old. He still lived with his mother, and he was in and out of the jail. In and out of the jail. And they said, you know, this is the last time that they'd let him out. What George did is, you know, he was so used to being in the jail, he didn't want to have to face his own addictions, right? And take responsibility for life. And so what does this ne'er-do-well do? You know, he goes out and he grabs a potted palm across the street at the nursery and walks it back over, sets it down on the steps at the sheriff's substation and says, and tells the deputy, "I just stole this, arrest me." Right? And so that's the George that George Wallace that I'm talking about. So it's Tuesday night, and we have to figure out what to do with George, because he was the closest, or is the closest thing to a completely illiterate adult I have ever met. George could write his own name after a fashion. He could recognize a few traffic signs, probably by their shape. But beyond that, he had almost no orientation to the written word. He didn't know the complete alphabet. He didn't have his words down. And so what we did with George is this. I worked also in a Lauren, my wife is here, she can verify this. I worked in a learning center as well for part of that time when I was down in Florida. You know, I mean, if this doesn't tell you something about how much teachers get paid. Anyway, what we'd done is I'd learned a strategy when I was working at the Learning Center, so that you would take take preschoolers who were just learning to read, and you could, and young children who were behind in the reading, and you could set them up with flashcards, right? And so I had a flashcard with a Dolch word list. And if you know what the Dolch word list is, these are the really basic words that you teach to people who are just learning to read. And so George and I had a stack of words that George was learning. And we set we would sit facing one another, and I would flash a card. You get half a second. All right, George, what's that word? And it was school, right? School, and then apple, and then she, and then rabbit, and then Santa Claus, right? We would flash these words, you know, as we went. And George, sometimes he would get them wrong, and we'd have to say, well, we'll keep working on that one. Other times, boy golly, he'd get it down in half a second, and we worked through the lesson. And you know, one night as we were going through that very lesson, I just got, you know, this, I've been screwing up my courage for a while, and I finally looked at him and I said, George, I just have to ask you, does your name ever cause a problem? You know, and he looked at me and he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, I mean, here you are. I mean, this was really, you know, tactful. I mean, here you are, you're a black male, and here you have the same name as this politician who's a racist. And he said, what? As it turns out, George Wallace had never heard of George Wallace. He had no idea what I was talking about. And so then I have to do this, you know, this really like awkward conversation where I explain to him that a man with his same name is fond of the KKK and is a racist politician. And at some point in there, as I try to, you know, belabor this explanation, George says, stop. And he looks at me and he says, can I borrow your pen? And so I handed him my pen and he says, give me your hand. And so I stuck my hand out and George took my pen and he put a little dot right there in the middle of my palm. And he said, you see that dot right there? I said, yes. He said, that dot right there is like the racism in that man you're talking about. He said, you shouldn't be putting him down. He said, that little racism part, that little piece of him, that's only one thing about him. That man has a lot more going on in his life. He has people who love him. He has people he loves. He has things he loves to do. And you're just, and you're just, you know, making him small. He said, I used to be a racist. He said, I didn't like white people, but I had to learn to like people like you. And I was thunderstruck. I honestly didn't know quite how to respond to that. And so I stumbled along and said something like, well, that's amazing, George. Let's go back to it. And so we went back, you know, and here we go. So I mean, I didn't know what to say, so it's back to this. You know, it's rabbits, Santa Claus, and school, and the lesson continued. I don't know where George is. I lost track of him. I mean, he could very easily have died from his addictions. I honestly don't know. I completely. He stopped coming to class. A few weeks later, they let him out, and I didn't see him again. I went on to do other things, and I pray that he's well. But it took me a long time to unpack what he was talking about, because you see, I can understand looking by a lot of things. I really can, but looking by racism. I mean, how does this work? You know, because what he was telling me, I began to realize was something pretty radical. And so a few years later, I had decided that I was going to go back to school. Imagine that. And so I ended up going to graduate school, and I read a philosopher by the name of Emanuel Levinas. And Levinas is a Jewish philosopher. Just short story in him is that Levinas saw a lot of his family die in the Holocaust, and he himself sat in a prison camp where he said the Nazi guards rather looked at him and his fellow inmates like apes. And he wrote a book called Totality and Infinity, and a bunch of other books too. But in Totality and Infinity, one of the things he wants to know is, how do you respond to that kind of hatred? How do you respond to that sort of ethnic hatred and racist hatred? How do you do that? And his answer was, you don't answer hate with hate. You answer hate with love. And that sounds really naive and sappy. But his answer, of course, is more complicated than that. He said, you know, when you look into the face, into the eyes of another human being, you are staring into infinity. And, you know, I didn't immediately connect that with what George told me back in that jail, you know, a decade or two earlier. But it didn't take me long until I started realizing it was the same thing. If we want to get past, you know, the name calling that we do, and we do a lot of it, we have to learn to change our ways. When I say name calling, what do? We call one another names. You know, we talk about Nazis and niggers. We talk about faggots and religious fundamentalists. You know, we talk about liberals and lesbians, Republicans and racists, and we dismiss people as idiots and with lots of other words. And what George and what Emanuel Levinas wanted us to recognize is that all of us have complicated stories. And if we want to move past the violence and the name calling, the totalizing names that we come from, that's totality and infinity, right? If we want to move past that sort of name calling, what do? And it's not about dismissing things. You know, this isn't about go hug a racist, right? Let's go find somebody we really despise and just, you know, without any critical reflection, just give them a hug, right? A big smooch on the face, right? No. This is about acknowledging differences and then finding ways to look beyond them and to recognize the infinity and the infinite possibilities of other people. And storytelling gives us a venue for doing that, for connecting with other people and moving beyond labels and moving beyond the totalizing things that we like to do with one another. And I want to thank George for helping me to